Today on the Quarter Hour podcast, we remember Derryn Hinch.
On Hinch tonight at 7 o'clock, a mother's anguish plea for justice. Plus, drugs in sport, stamping out steroids with lie detectors. That's live. That's Hinch tonight at 7.
Yeah, the sad news today that the radio icon Derryn Hinch has passed away, age 82. Someone that worked in the building with him at 3AW for many years. We know Justin Smith from the TV radio commentator. He's on the ABC. Hey, Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Glad. Thank you, mate. Very kind.
It wasn't a surprise, but it was certainly sad news, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he had been crook on and off, I know, and a lot of people knew because he kept people informed, had a liver transplant a few years ago, had problems here and there, and then... But, I mean, I think I saw a post from him on Facebook only a few days ago, unless I'm very wrong. I think he was posting about eggs that he was eating. It's kind of like putting up posts like that. But he's also one of those guys, one of the things that Hinch used to say about himself, it was one of those classic kind of Hinch lines. He'd say, "You can't kill weeds." And he'd say that. So someone would say, "How are you, Derryn?" "Oh, you can't kill weeds," So he was a bit like that. And so I guess you think he's going to go, if he had any say in it, he'd go on forever. But the other thing he used to say was, they'd say, "How do you stay so busy?" And he said, "I'll sleep when I'm dead." Yeah, I mean, I remember going to see him up in his apartment there on St Kilda Road when he was in one of his home detention lockdowns, court-ordered holidays, and, pictures of Derryn on the wall, and he used to like to collect old typewriters, and to memory, I think he had an ankle bracelet on, and he was just a carnival. The guy was just a complete carnival. You
got to see the radio version of him. For me, it was purely TV. I mean, we had him on TV in Queensland where I grew up in the 80s, and he was the biggest guy on TV. He was, they took the mickey out of him on Fast Forward. Talk me through, I guess, your earliest memories of him on the telly, because we famously know he was offered the gig on 60 Minutes and he turned it down. I've got memories of him in his early career at the moon landing or the rocket launch. Like, he did stuff. He just did good things, didn't he?
Look, he did. And I mean, he loved a big story. He was, I think, with all the pizzazz that went with him, he was a journalist at heart, and he loved the story. And I seem to remember him, it was in an interview. I don't think it was a personal conversation. I think it was in an interview, and they said, "What would you want? Would you want a gold logie? Would you want a happy marriage?" I can't remember the list. "Or would you want the big story?" "Oh, the big story. I want the big story." So he had that right in the middle of him, and he was able to. So the first memories, I like TV and radio, but for me, I was a big fan of him on radio. And one of the things that I liked about him is that and this is very rare, and I don't know if he's have been around for a while in recent times, but he was able to create the feeling that the story and what was happening right now was just bloody enormous, and it wasn't, when you listened to him, it wasn't as though he was talking through a microphone just in a studios you've sat in, studios I've sat in. It wasn't like that. It was like he was somewhere else. It was bigger than just that radio thing. And he, he'd come on, he'd play the That's Life theme, and he'd "Good afternoon, you're not going to like this," and then he'd launch into the opener. And it was just, the theatre of him was what I remember. He was able to make those big stories even bigger. He liked to stir things up, particularly, when people died. He would say, "All that history owes the dead is the truth." And he would dig up old stories about them. And I know that, I think it's worth mentioning these things. That caused a lot of pain to the family of those people, but he sort of pushed on with it. So he could be kind of self-centered about that, about putting himself in the middle of stories. And I don't think anybody who knew him would deny that. But he was also irresistible in the way that he could tell a story, and also equally as much as that could cause pain to people, he was also the way he put himself into a story also made that story bigger, and sometimes that was important.
You roamed the halls with him in your time at 3AW. You obviously knew him personally. What was his day-to-day radio activity like? What time would he get in? What was he like at putting a show together? He seemed to have a lot on his show every day.
Yeah, dude, that's a good question. I was working on another program. There was a couple of stories that, unfolding stories. I think I jumped in there and sort of lent a hand as you do in those kind of places. But I didn't produce him. But I did have an office next to him. So he'd sort of come in. I think he'd get up first thing and read the papers. And I think that was a habit, a daily habit more than anything, more than just work. And then he'd get in probably later, than he's certainly later than his producers, but then he'd say, right, let's have a, conference. He'd say, I'm going to get a coffee and let's have a conference. And then they'd sit down and sort of plan it. And then he'd start writing, because I think writing those editorials was really important to him. And he did that really well, like those written editorials and the things that go on a bit, let's not deny it. They'd really, you'd be listening to the radio and say, come on, Derryn, yes, let's go, let's get to it, But he wrote them beautifully, and he delivered them in that style. So he could just make the story big. And, I guess I'll just leave it to other people whether that's lacking now to make those stories big,
In the scheme of radio, and he always seemed to rate very well from my recollection, how good was he?
Yeah, I think he was really good. He was a very, very good broadcaster. There's absolutely no getting around it. He was a good broadcaster. He did it very well. He could just sell that story, and he'd get the callers on. He sort of knew how long to milk it for. He knew when to get out. He knew how to, when to get all over something. And I think one of his old panel operators mentioned this to me, and it was an interesting one. He said other broadcasters would look and say, well, what's Melbourne talking about today? But Hinch would say, what do I want to tell Melbourne today? So it's a very different approach. It wasn't so as much of a journalist as he was, and as much as he liked those bigger stories, he was more about what can I tell them? And yes, that's certainly a self-centered approach, but that's sort of, I guess, what worked for him and what was needed. And because no one else was doing it like that.
Was he let go too soon? I have a memory of the day he was let go. He comes on air at 4:00. He'd just been sacked, but was allowed to go back on the air, as professional as he was. And he said, management are going in a different direction. I'm number one, so that must be down.
Well, is he wrong? Was he wrong? It's not a bad point, is it? He said, well, I'm number one, and they told me I'm going because they want to go in a different direction. And I think management did some very strange things, and said some very strange things. I think they said that they want to, social media. They said they wanted a bigger social media presence. And he said, well, the person you're going to replace me with has far fewer Twitter followers than I've got. So what are we talking about here? And I'm number one, and you want to go in a different direction. You're quite right. You remember the line very well. But that was, I think one of his other lines that I loved is he said, was it him that said it or somebody else said it about him? But he certainly endorsed the line. What does Hinch and Santa Claus have in common? They're both looking for a job in January. He would love to say that, I've been sacked 16 times, and then the number it didn't. You could not, this is the other thing, Liam, you could not keep him down, right? You couldn't keep Hinch down. Is if you sacked him, he'd say, I'm going to write a book then. I've been wanting to write a book about bloody Scrabble or something or whatever. He'd have one ready to go. And I really admired that about him, that if he got sacked or something happened to him and it just didn't work out, there wasn't a woe is me. He'd talk about it as much as he possibly could, like you just mentioned there. But then he'd say, well, look, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to go and get on with this and whatever. And it was kind of good. I always said, look, if you cut off Hinch's legs and one arm and took him out to Dalesford or something just outside and buried him, in 2 days' time, you'd just see him crawling back with one arm, covered in mud, down Collins Street. You just couldn't kill him. And there's a bit to admire there.
He had some enemies. From the outside, I could see that he and Neil Mitchell didn't get along very well. Why wasn't he liked?
Oh, look, I think he'd stirred people up, and other broadcasters would stir them. Look, this might come as a galloping shock to you, Liam, but there's some pretty big egos flying around in a place like 3AW, possibly now, but particularly back then. So, you've got the clash of a couple of bulls, in a paddock. And Hinch, I don't know if Hinch really liked getting along with people. I think he's probably that kind of guy that if he's getting along with everyone, he feels a bit out of whack. So he's got to find a. What's the old line? He's got to find there's a bar fight waiting for him somewhere. So he's got to go and find it.
Was that part of the act? I mean, it's always good to have an enemy in radio, especially talkback radio. And I met him once or twice, and he was personable. He wasn't sitting in the corner on his own. He'd come up and shake your hand and say hi, would ask you questions, because the audience seemed to love him, and he loved the audience. He just loved to pick a fight.
He did. He loved to pick a fight. And I really believe that he just felt that that's what you do. You pick fights with people. And he did like doing that. Yeah, and he was personable. He was good to his audience. His audience were very loyal to him. The times that I had anything to do with him personally were great. And he didn't hold a grudge. He threatened to sue me once, and then 2 days later, how are you, mate? What's going on? What are you up to? It was something I said on radio that, he said he wanted an apology for, and that's okay. It was no big deal, but it was kind of like, lawyers at 20 paces for a couple of minutes. And then then he just didn't get, and if I guarantee you, 6 months after, if someone had said, oh, do you remember that thing about it? He wouldn't have had a clue, wouldn't have remembered it. Strange one.
Talk to me about his playful side. He was in the Farnham film clip of the 80s. He loved it that Vizar did a take of him on the TV. He must have had a sense of humour.
Oh, yeah, he did. And I think, who was it? I think it was Gore Vidal said there's two things in this world that you never knock back, sex and appearing on television. And Hinch embraced that philosophy. If somebody, he would turn up for things and go on it. And he was a bit of a, I don't say this as an insult to him, but he was a ham. He liked, I think, Wog Boys. He was in the movie Wog Boys, and the John Farnham thing. He loved that stuff. He loved it. He was a bit of a performer and a bit of a celebrity. And I used to, say to people that, there were people that I knew that could complain once in a while that they didn't get the same sort of attention as Hinch got. And my feeling was that Hinch is Michael Jackson. People could not imagine their life being like Hinch's, and they couldn't imagine their life being like Michael Jackson. So he was just unreal to people, and that's sort of the nature of celebrity a bit. They could imagine themselves being, lots of other people on TV and on radio, but they couldn't imagine themselves being Hinch. They just go, what is this guy's life? He was Michael Jackson,
What will he be remembered for?
Oh, gee, that's going to be a complicated one. I think he's going to be remembered as a stirrer. I think he will be remembered in radio terms as being a very good broadcaster and being good at it. People who loved him on radio, I think, will certainly remember him like that. Some people will remember him as a dead set prick. There's absolutely no doubt that there's going to be some people jumping on to say that he did some appalling things at times and hurt people. That's going to come. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So there'll probably be, in essence, there'll be a percentage of that when it comes to remembering him. Yeah.
Let's talk radio just before we let you go. What's radio going to remember him for? What did we learn about him, his tricks? What was he so good at on the air?
Yeah, I think he was really good at at writing an editorial and delivering it, which sort of seems a little bit, passé, like a little bit, oh yeah, well, of course that's what you do. But I'm not sure if anyone was really doing that before. You'd have the kind of like, let's go back to the early 80s. You'd have sort of, ABC type presenters presenting things, and you would have then the Sydney shock jock type persona where they'd sort of throw things in. But Hinch was that kind of, he brought that newspapery kind of, let's really write this and get it together and then bang, throw it out there. And I just don't think that was happening like that before. And I think he was a bit of I think pioneer's too big a word for it, because there were probably other people around, but I don't think anyone did it with the same chutzpah as Derryn did. I think that's going to be his legacy. I think that's how he changed radio, because you can still feel that today.
I think, though, if you were to create a top 5 of greatest Australian talkback hosts, he's certainly in there. You think of names like Laws, Zemanek, Mitchell. Hinch is in that list.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely, and also the fact that the way he did talkback was constantly picking fights with people, and so he would have people, he liked people ringing and telling him he was terrific, and there's radio people who don't like that, but he'd have people telling him he's terrific, but he didn't mind a blue, he didn't mind having a fight, and again, who else was kind of doing that? And as far as I know, there's no one Hinch didn't let on air. If you have a look at Sydney, people go on about Ray Hadley, for example. Well, I've listened to Hadley for years on and off for different reasons. I've never heard him let on anyone on air to criticise him. Now, maybe he never got a call of someone wanting to criticise him. Maybe that they never called in, but I just don't think that would be the case. But they never got on. Hinch wasn't like that. Hinch had some balls about him. And when people called in and wanted to have a go, they got on and they got to have a go. And he went back at them. And I think that there's a lot of courage in that, I think.
Final question for you, mate. Is there a fond memory? Is there a radio memory? Is there something that will stick in your mind that you go, Hinch?
Yeah. All right. Very quick story for you. So, yes, this one. So I was producing the morning's program, and Van Nguyen, who an Australian kid who was caught with drugs in Singapore, and they were going to execute him. We decided on mornings, I was working with Neil Mitchell, that Van Nguyen was going to be executed. I think it was either at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, our time, exactly on the dot. And on the dot, bells were going to ring outside. And I thought, well, look, if it's going to happen exactly on a time, let's drop the news or delay the news. We'll just hold off and we'll take the bells live. I think it was a very big story and a very big moment, and an awful moment, obviously. And I certainly don't mean to trivialise it. But for weeks, we were, Neil Mitchell was talking about it. And for weeks, Hinch was on the other side, because Neil was anti-death penalty and Hinch was, no, kill him. He knew what he was doing, and Hinch would go on and on and on. So I got a call from station management at around about 2 o'clock, and they just said, you've got to listen to Hinch at 4. This is going to be great. And they just put the phone down. So I listened to Hinch at 4, and Hinch came on. I'm trying to paraphrase here. Maybe the story gets better with time, but Hinch came on and he said, there are certain things in this world you rely on. You rely on a mother's love, the sun coming up in the morning, and the news at the top of the hour. And he just went on this. I don't even know how long it went on for, about how disgraceful it was that Mitchell dropped the news, and the news is something you rely on, and why are we dropping the news for a drug dealer, and how can he ever be trusted again? And it just went on and on and on, and it didn't stop. And then he started taking calls with people saying, you're right, Derryn, you're right, we should never have done it. And he just turned it in. Like, everyone forgot that it was a death penalty story and something horrible had just happened to a young man, and it would turned into a Derryn versus Neil story. And that was the kind of... But the other thing was, with that, he would have meant it. So that would have been genuine. He would not have said, listen, I bet you I can get a little bit of attention here. And yes, he did do that from time to time. But I think he genuinely felt, this is... Because he'd been going on about it for weeks. But it was just... And again, the story turned into something else because of the way he delivered it. That's kind of him. So.
Mate, can we thank you for being available today? Thank you for your insight and your memories. You got a bird's eye view. You saw it close to the most. And I guess it is a sad day for radio as we remember Derryn Hinch and Justin Smith. Great to have you on the Quarter Hour podcast.
Yes, thanks, mate. Lots of love to his friends. He had a lot of loyal friends. So, obviously thinking about them today. Lots of love to them. And thanks, Liam. Appreciate it.
And so, I guess, coming up now, here we go. For the last time. Thank your mother for the rabbits. That's life. And from 3AW, bye-bye.